You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary. For nearly 150 years, Calvin Seminary has been a thought leader in Reformed faith and scholarship. We invite you to join us and our guests as we wrestle with the questions of mercy, justice, faith, and formation. We do not have all the answers, but we believe how we pursue them matters. This is the Forum Podcast.
This is a previously unreleased episode from our content archives. While some events or references may be dated, we believe the content is just as relevant today as it was when we recorded it, and we think you'll agree. In this episode, Danjuma Gibson speaks on shared trauma. He starts by offering a definition of trauma and continues to speak on the shared experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Danjuma Gibson is the Professor of Pastoral Theology, Care, and Counseling at Calvin Theological Seminary. Dr. Gibson and Einfeld, Director of Lifelong Learning, joins in the conversation to discuss working on traumatic experiences. Gibson and Einfeld offer perspective of leading while going through traumatic situations.
Well, thanks, Danjuma, for coming in for this conversation.
No problem, Aaron. Thank you for the invitation.
Your office is just down the hall from me, so I appreciate our conversations that we have. I'm also just excited because you bring so much to the conversation we're about to have. I'm going to miss some things, but you've been a banker, you've been a therapist, you're a theologian, you're a father, you're a pastor. There's probably all kinds of roles that I don't know about in your life that you are. Professor. Oh, yeah, I guess you're a professor at Calvin Seminary.
Right.
So I'm really interested, though, in hearing about your expertise in trauma, particularly collective trauma. As we think about, as we record this, somehow coming out of the pandemic. And the question I want us to wonder about today is, what happened?
Sure.
And where do we go from here? Specifically for the pastors who are listening, who are recovering themselves personally from the pandemic, but then also trying to bring their congregations out, what that means. So I'm excited to hear from you. Yeah.
Well, I think part of how, I approach this, and you talked about some of my background. So in addition to being in my past life, being a banker, I was a senior pastor in Chicago for 16 and a half years. I was the fifth pastor in 100 years.
All right.
So this church did not turn over pastors fast at all. I was the fifth pastor in their 100-plus year history. And so being a pastor in a community, a church that was lodged in a broader urban community, but then also when I say community, thinking about the community that I served for those 16 and a half years. One of the things that led me to go back to school and pursue my PhD studies in clinical psychology and pastoral theology was just noticing sort of the ebbs and flows in individual and community emotional life. I use the word, especially in my upcoming book, I use the word psycho-spiritual because I don't think you can separate the two. We've tried to separate the two. I think it's in a very harmful way in our Western society. But you would see ebbs and flows in the psycho-spiritual vitality of individuals and communities. And, it's far more difficult, I think, just to read about it academically. But if you come to it having experienced it, but you didn't have the language for it, but you've seen it, I began to ask questions that no longer could be answered by just pop culture books that you may find
right
in a bookstore or a Christian bookstore, and I have no problem with it. I'm not saying that it's not effective, but that all led to my my desire to go back and pursue my PhD studies, and then my focus on Frederick Douglass, and saying, okay, how did this human being in that context of extremity, how do we understand, or how can we begin to reinterpret categories like trauma, resilience, healing, just as a matter of not only theological anthropology, but psychological anthropology? What can we learn from that, from that great cloud of witnesses? And how can that guide us in how we think about, now to your question of what happened, COVID, and what's happening now post-COVID?
Excellent. Well, part of what I want to talk about today is some of the data coming in from Barna about the way you put it, the psycho-spiritual health of our pastors is it's ebbed and flowed. It's declined since the pandemic. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But can you just define trauma for me? I mean, people say, "Oh, that was traumatizing." It's kind of in our lingo now. Help me understand that. What is trauma?
So on the one hand, social media has its pros and cons. It can be very helpful, but it can be harmful.
Right.
Social media will only get stronger. And so from that perspective, or it's only going to get more robust. We're not going back. And from that perspective, I'm appreciative of how mental health awareness permeates nearly on a 24/7 cycle, just the social media outlets, and there's a greater awareness of the need for mental health awareness, and in particular trauma. The downside is it can lose its effectiveness, and you can have all of these sorts of mainstream ideas about a concept that are not necessarily helpful, and in some cases can be harmful. And so I'm glad we're talking about trauma a lot more, but then everyone's talking about they've been traumatized all day long.
Right.
Really, and it's nothing but a bad argument they had. And trauma is not a bad argument you had with your best friend. It's not a bad day at work, unless, God forbid, there was a mass shooting.
Of course.
Trauma is not that you didn't get your way, and I'll get back to that because I did not mean that tongue in cheek. But so when I talk about trauma, or when I respond to your question, I'm really talking about a clinical definition of trauma that we saw emerge out of war, and I'm always forever impressed and guided by the work of Judith Herman, which in many respects in the early 80s, I believe her work put trauma really on the table in a more robust way. And she worked with, talks about it from the perspective of political prisoners and the abuse of women and children. When you have experienced trauma, we're talking about basically emotional shock. Something has occurred that has overwhelmed you in that moment, your normal emotional and psychological faculties that give you a sense of control, a sense of meaning. Even in this very moment right now, you and I, in a deeply unconscious way, are experiencing a degree that we have control over our lives. That after we're done here, we're going to leave a room, we're going to walk up some stairs and carry on. A traumatizing event disrupts that in a very violent way that renders you powerless, takes your control away, and you don't have any pre-existing faculties to make sense of what has just happened, such as a soldier for the first time or numerous times seeing their colleague blown away.
Right.
That's not an everyday occurrence that you see. And so
No.
it sends your body, it sends you into shock. In many ways, a key characteristic of trauma is that it paralyzes a person psychologically in that moment. So if you talk to someone who's been traumatized, a common theme you'll see, they'll say, I can see it like it was yesterday. I can see it like it just happened. And this is an event that may have happened 30 years ago. Sometimes with my students, I'll liken trauma to their computers, where, you know, you have storage space, how much storage does those computer have, and then you have memory. On a Mac, it's that little ball, that little rainbow ball.
Yeah.
On a PC, it's the little spinning cursor. When you see that, for anyone, what happens? We get scared because we haven't saved our information, and it means that there's a memory overload. Our bodies are like that. Something has happened that has sent your sense of control, it sent your psychological faculties into shock. Doesn't have to result in PTSD. Sometimes it does, where you are paralyzed in a permanent state of hyperarousal.
Mm-hmm.
And this can happen with an individual. It can happen with groups. And I think COVID did this in some respects to a lot of communities. I think other communities, they are dealing not necessarily with individual or group trauma, but they are dealing with blocked mourning, blocked grief, where their experience may not have been traumatizing, but they cannot come to terms with what they have lost and will not get back in that community.
Wow, that's powerful.
So, for example, here in Grand Rapids, I'll say I've seen this, I've heard this narrative in a couple of spaces. I was talking to a pastor here in the city and said within 10 months, he had done, it was like over 24 funerals.
Right.
Just for the sake of our conversation here, let's just say that's not normal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you numb, your community numbs. If I fall down a flight of steps, I can be injured, but it doesn't necessarily have to be traumatizing, because you still have your sense of control. You say, I can watch my step. One of the keys of trauma is you didn't have control.
Mm-hmm.
What was unthinkable has now become thinkable.
Is it sometimes like a continuum? It's not like binary, where it's trauma or not trauma. So I'm, of course, listening through my own experience. For example, I can remember back when the pandemic started, waking up in the morning, racing heart with panic, looking at the news, watching it happen, watching it move to Italy, watching it. And I remember that was bad, right? That was, and I lost control over a lot of things in my life. But I work from home. Mm-hmm. I didn't lose all control. Mm-hmm. I'm privileged in many ways. And I suspect many listeners might relate to that experience. So part of my own meaning making is like, did I experience collective trauma, or was I just shocked, or what happened to me?
It very well could have. I mean, it's left up to the individual. I would argue I lean more towards, I can't diagnose you. I'm not trying to. You can't diagnose anyone, but you haven't experienced a once-in-a-century pandemic that literally overnight shut the world down.
Yeah, billions of people were
shut the world, and you're
down,
getting
right?
this information. People are dying left and right, and how do you protect yourself? And when you talk about privilege, I think one of the silent victims in all of this are children.
Oh, yeah.
The data that is coming out of all of a sudden telling a child, you're not going to school for months, and being in isolation for months. in their home, that still has an effect, a fallout that we are seeing that we haven't come to terms with. The elderly, who already in our normative capitalism society, the elderly tend to be pushed to the margins.
That's right.
As people who are not productive or generate capital or money. And so they're already dealing with incidents of isolation. And now you have this.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember it happened during the time when my parents were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary.
Oh.
And we left gifts at the front gate. That was not how we had envisioned celebrating that just a year prior. Looking at the news and seeing hospitals, doctors crying, nurses crying, saying they are turning rooms into makeshift morgues. What happened in New York, having to dig out new places to put bodies. So seeing all of this on a 24/7 news cycle, has this had an impact on the church, whether we want to acknowledge it or not? It absolutely has.
Yeah.
And mistake number one is thinking that healing is getting back to the way we used to be. That's mistake number one.
You're preaching now. Why not? I'm tracking with you. Why don't we go back to normal?
Because it is impossible to unsee what you have seen.
Yeah.
And unexperienced what you have experienced. So this press, and you can try to make it biblical. You can try to theologize. We need to get back. It's really a maladaptive coping mechanism where you are pounding and arguing and demanding that the way things were, that represents true faith. No, you're now having to understand what is it to worship a crucified Savior who didn't overthrow the empire like you thought a Messiah would. A crucified Savior that comes to you and says, Thomas, I'll prove to you I am who I am. Put your hand in my wound.
Right.
There's no going back to an uncrucified, brutalized, murdered Messiah. And I think pastors are having to wrap their minds around this. Church leadership. Pastors are also prime victims in this because they can have communities. So churches have personalities just like individuals.
Yeah.
And you can have communities. I was just talking about this at a church in the CRC a couple of weeks ago. What we call the golden age fallacy, where the unconscious expectation of the congregation to the pastor is, you will take us back to the golden age.
Yeah. You're saying that was the case before COVID?
Yes.
That we were even yet trying to go back to the golden age of some era bygone.
Yes.
And now COVID has happened, and maybe that's accelerated that sense of...
And COVID just added layers, as well as I do. Even before COVID, the numbers that churches were seeing in decline, the decline in theological education and enrollment and things. Now you add a global pandemic on top of that.
Yeah.
Now you add what was already pastors having to become more bivocational.
Yeah.
A common theme we're hearing in a lot of churches is the lost members. Where are they? They didn't come back.
Yeah, the way the way I have been thinking about the pandemic is it's like a bright light got shown in the basement, and all the stuff all of a sudden was laid bare. And some of us already knew it was there the whole time. And others were just shocked by seeing injustice more up close, disproportionate effects more up close. And there's this bright light shining on pre-existing conditions in our institutions, in our churches.
I love it.
In ourselves, too.
Yeah.
what my prayer, my hope is that we see this as an opportunity to get to the stuff. You know, and I'll give an example.
That's excellent.
My house, we live in Michigan, and the roads are just they're terrible. So if you've never been to Michigan and you're listening, as soon as you get across the border, your car just starts jarring. I travel for work, and I tell my wife, hey, the roads are so nice
then you
in Ontario.
Then welcome to Michigan, and all of a sudden.
And we have potholes in the street in my yard, in front of my house. Last fall, this crew came and they were blowing this kind of black rock shard stuff. They filled the cracks. Mm-hmm. The next day, little pebbles were washing away from that thing. Mm-hmm. And it feels like the golden age is like trying to put that on there. Mm-hmm. And that we're really, maybe the road wasn't as healthy as we thought in the first place. But doesn't that just mean that Christ's love, Christ's redemption is just even bigger and deeper than we thought at first?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that's my prayer.
Absolutely. Just the idea or the concept of the gospel is far more complex and robust than we tend to talk about. We tend to just limit it. I was telling my students today, we tend to limit it to just bringing people to Christ. That's all the gospel is. So generally, the gospel is not for anybody already in the church, just for those who are outside, right? That's
We're all right. We don't agree with the others.
Got it. This is for you guys. No, this is the complexity and just the millions of layers all of us are living in right now and trying to understand what's happening to make meaning of it.
Yeah.
That's also, I believe, part of what the gospel is designed for.
Tell me about, I want to talk a little bit about the subconscious. Mm-hmm. I deeply resonated with your word blocked grief, just because that I think I experienced that during the pandemic, and I suspect many others have too. And I think we carry it subconsciously. I agree. I mean, this was maybe last summer. I was doing a workout video on my own. I was exercising, and then I was doing one of these cool down stretches. And I was stretching, doing some deep breathing, and all of a sudden it just came, and I started sobbing about the pandemic and everything that had happened. And this was, I think it was 2022, you know. Somehow all those numbers, the million in the United States, the 20 million across the world, still as we're recording this, 200 people a day are still dying of COVID. So in my experience, it seems like that block, something unleashed it and got it out. We're probably all carrying a lot of stuff subconsciously. What do we need to know about the subconscious as everyday people trying to live our lives, raise our kids, lead our churches? Like, what do we need to know about subconscious?
Well, obviously, I'm biased towards the unconscious because I'm a psychotherapist.
Of course, that's what I'm asking.
At its core, you know, I'll tell my clients the work is about making the unconscious conscious. And I think for our purposes here, if we're talking about blocked mourning or the inability to mourn, repressed grief, there's another category called disenfranchised grief. All of that comes from a lot of the cultural messaging that we get, whether it's in our family systems, our family of origin, and even church culture, which we haven't talked a lot about, but I want to do more work around. And that is this idea of church culture of Christian triumphalism, that coming across as being strong, being well, being okay, demonstrating that, acting strong and well, that there's somehow virtue in it, that healing is about not doing the work to become well, but portraying that you are well. And in that, we have learned very efficiently how to deny pain, deny grief, and overlook or ignore or become indifferent to anything that serves as the precursor to the pain or has caused the pain. So we're not talking about just when we talk about the unconscious and we talk about the inability to mourn, I tell my students sometimes that one of the basic responsibility or one of the most basic responsibilities of a pastor is to compel the community to mourn. We don't like it. But when we repress it, that also means that we are in danger of becoming indifferent to the human suffering that causes the trauma or the grief and the loss, and we just learn to be numb.
It's too much for us to look at.
It's too much to look at. And so we valorize indifference. We valorize, and some people could say, well, you would say something like this, Dr. Gibson, but we valorize happiness at all costs. Happiness at all costs. Happiness becomes the form of sanctification. And we see this across cultures. There's just not one religious culture. We can see this across cultures. And we have to do work. That results in a lot of times what I call emotional constipation. We have to do work to undo those harmful practices that a lot of times we have simply internalized by watching others before us. So it's not like our parents or the pastor or a teacher came and said, Aaron, ignore your pain.
Right.
No, you just probably saw that in your lifetime 1,000,000 times.
Yeah.
That this is what you have to do. This is the interpretation of success.
Yeah.
Don't take it personal. Ignore your pain. Transact and be productive.
Somehow that resonates with me. Right. Yeah.
And it's not working out, is it, with us as
No.
a society? It's not working. And to your point, you said the pandemic.
Shone a light.
Shone a light. People don't like to talk about it, but you can't separate COVID from the political and social and cultural and racial fallout that we saw the last 2 to 3, 4 years.
Yeah.
You can't separate it. And that's another thing the church tries to do. That's out there, but it doesn't affect us. No. What we're seeing out there, that reflects our behavior as well.
Yeah. So just as I'm hearing you talk, that's such a big topic. I'm trying to think of even where we dig into that. I'm resonating with what you're saying. It feels like so much. And like you said, we're not doing so great. And things bubble up here and there, church conflicts. The data from the Barna study recently shows people aren't well, pastors especially, many of them. Just as I'm sitting in the room hearing you talk, it feels overwhelming. And it feels like, where do we go? That question of where do we go from here? I'm thinking of it in like two directions. One is, let's talk to the pastors. We know what not to do. Project happiness, religious platitudes, right? Those kinds of things. Not religious, but theological platitudes saying, too blessed to be stressed, that kind of stuff, right?
That's religious too, yeah.
I know. So,
I've heard that 1,000,000 times.
I
wow.
bet, yeah.
I just thought they said that in Chicago.
Or prayer. And this is a leading question because we're going to talk about therapy. But individuals, what can pastors do to improve their psycho-spiritual health? What do we do? And then in some ways, how are we supposed to help improve the psycho-spiritual health of the folks around us? And I talk to a lot of pastors in my role, and a lot of pastors have this sense of like they're performing, they're productive, they're leading a church, but inside it's almost like they feel like a fraud because they're not well. They're not feeling grace. They may preach about grace, but not feel it. So how do we help pastors get well?
So my response to that, I shy away from a sort of one answer, fix it.
Yeah.
Because that just really depends on the pastor,
Okay.
the culture. But with that being said, I think several things. Seeking spaces outside or away from the ministry. When we think about mental well-being and mental health, a lot of we think it's harmful, or it's just simply not helpful when you think of it as on a binary of you're well or you're not well.
Mm-hmm.
There is a vast middle space where we need to think about you have a space of your own where you can just go and process.
Mm-hmm. Is that what therapy often is?
I would say that's at the heart of therapy. There is, I think, a misnomer that therapy is about I'm giving you answers and telling you how to live your life. And I think in some ways that is where a religious fear of it comes. The therapist is not in competition with the pastor. We're just one point, as I teach my students, on the continuum of care. There's a particular role that mental health, and whether that's a social worker, psychologist, psychotherapist, psychiatrist, just as your primary care physician, there is a particular role that they play in a continuum of care for holistic health and healing.
Yeah.
And so to think of therapy to be diametrically opposed to or mutually exclusive to what you do in the church is very harmful. And I hear that talked about a lot.
Okay.
Either the pastor or the therapist. That's a very dangerous choice. You need both.
Yeah.
You need, or your spiritual caregiver, however you look at that, your clergy person, your chaplain, there's a need for both. My invitation to pastors is, as a start, finding a space where you can name, where you have the freedom to name your frustrations, your hurts, your losses, where you have a space, even if that is not with a professional therapist. It could be a spiritual caregiver. It could be someone else. Another term I like to use, I get this from James Deedus in his classic text. You want to be in a space where you're not a player in the person's life, meaning this. The reason the church can't be the space for the pastor a lot of times is because the pastor is a player in people's lives, meaning he or she has to be a certain way. The church wants the pastor not to hurt. We want the pastor never to be tired. We don't want to hear that the pastor is wrestling with despair and, dare I say, nihilism. We don't want the church. So the pastor, yes,
yeah.
The pastor has to always so you have a vested interest in. There's a vested emotional interest there. You have to find some place where you can separate, where the listener or the listeners do not have that requirement of you, where there's no social etiquette that you have to comply with. So I understand for a lot of people going immediately, they may not be comfortable with therapy for a number of reasons. They may not have access to it. So there can be a lot of reasons. If you have access to it, you have the wherewithal for it, I highly recommend it, whether that's spiritual direction or therapy. But for some people, there may be steps to it. In some cultures, it's a trust issue.
Okay.
Where they don't necessarily trust someone they don't know. So then how do you so now I'm characterizing the nature of spaces I'm encouraging them to find. You have to be able to step out of your ministry setting. And I know some feel like they can't do that, and I know they value their work, or what happens if they step away. And a lot of times I tell my students, let me tell you something. If you die today, they will have someone in that pulpit preaching next Sunday. I promise you. But your wife or children will not have you back next week.
Right. Wow. Yep.
So you need to understand the rawness of that reality and begin to take more intentional steps. We tend to think of self-work and self-care as options, modern day options. Mm-hmm. The way I teach it, no, self-care is a matter of Christian ethics.
In a matter of survival too, right?
It's a matter, yeah. And so if it's survival,
yeah,
it's a moral issue.
Great. Yep.
It's a moral issue.
Yeah.
It's an ethical issue.
Yeah.
It is unethical not to take care of yourself. It's immoral. If you lose your family or your marriage in the process of doing ministry, I'm not sure you had a ministry. I don't know what you call it.
And that's common, right? I mean, more common than...
Do interviews. Maybe you can do it with me. Interviews of the adult children of preachers or the adult children of missionaries and see how they feel about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, feels like a human need for this space, a particular and accentuated need for pastors, given the role of being spiritual care providers, public figures. We need spaces, whether it's a professional therapist or a trained coach or a social worker or even a close friend, right?
Close friend.
But tell me why therapy and not like, hey, my friend who I vent to, or, you know, a pastor listening can say, well, I bet I could provide that space for somebody.
And you know what? They can.
Uh-huh.
If they understand what to do and what not to do.
Okay.
And so there was an article I wrote for the Banner a couple of years ago. And it was, I think the title of it was Christian Triumphalism, the Antithesis of Recovering from Trauma.
I remember that one.
And in it, I talked about, because I understand, again, not everyone will walk away and say, hey, let me go sign up and let me pay a therapist. But churches can be excellent places if we can tone down, if I can tone down my requirement for you to be a player in my life. Mm-hmm. Churches can be excellent spaces, communities for storytelling.
Okay.
For narrative reconstruction, where sometimes I'll use the term, we get to a place in our life where our existing theological, the way we make meaning, the shelf life has expired. And we have to reconstruct it. Sometimes you've seen this in other church traditions as testimony service. So now we're not talking about a high church model. We're really talking about a low church model where people testify. They can have a shut-in service all night, and those who are there, it's just affirming. We are standing in solidarity with your testimony. You are the protagonist of your story, and for that moment, it is an unequivocal affirmation of how you are experiencing life as a human being in your testimony. Being able to share your story, which is really what you're doing in therapy, but sharing it in an environment where it is non-judgmental. Yeah. People are not supposing that or being arrogant enough to believe that I have the wherewithal to heal you. That I know exactly what you need to be doing in your life. If you can relax all of those player tendencies, churches can be an excellent source, an excellent place where that sort of narrative reconstruction, we heal a lot through telling our story over and over and over again.
talking about COVID, I feel like that's why I can experience that too. Remember when? What were you like? And it just there's a catharsis of telling your story.
I've come across research that talks about how people recovered after 9/11, of the trauma of 9/11, and part of the recovery was because it happened in front of the world. I didn't have to take the time to explain to you what happened to me.
Oh, yeah.
You saw it.
Yeah.
That can really be the impediment to healing right there, just getting people to believe what happened to you and to understand it. And so you're spending so much time trying to just get people to accept the narrative of what happened to you that you wash out. If churches can get around that, this is what Rogers was talking about when he says unconditional positive regard.
Right.
People get that mixed up all the time. That's not saying yes to everything. It is whatever you say happened to you, whatever you say is going on with you, how you feel, there's unconditional regard for that.
Yeah.
It is as you say it is.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not going to judge it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be suspicious of Aaron.
Right.
So there is potential in the body of Christ for it, but there are some harmful practices that we have to confess, that we have to get rid of, so that our churches can be more, can be those spaces, not safe spaces, but what sometimes we refer to as brave spaces.
Exactly. Yeah.
Another example, a couple of years ago, I talked, there was a church out south here of the city, and it was chaplains, but it was for Army veterans.
Okay.
And a lot of the testimony around how they just feel they live in a different world, just misunderstood. And that night, they shared a lot of their stories, some of their stories amongst each other. People who served in various wars. It was difficult to hear. In some respects, I was shocked. I wasn't prepared. Now, I was there.
You've heard a lot.
Yeah, I've
right?
heard
You're
a lot.
Licensed therapist. You heard a lot.
And, I begin the evening saying, hey, this has to be a brave space, not a safe space. And as I listened to it, but then I thought, this can't be considered an aberration of normal ecclesial life. Jesus would say their horror, what they experienced, it has to be integrated.
Isn't that what Christ literally took it on?
Absolutely.
He literally took it on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That has to become a part of how we understand ecclesial life, how we understand Christian praxis. And we've really abandoned that. It reminds me of something Howard Thurman talks about in his preface to Jesus and the Disinherited. There's a line in there. He says, imagine what the faith would be had it remained in the hands of a marginalized community versus getting into the hands of the empire, starting with Constantine on.
The powers that be.
The powers. So it takes on, our understanding of the faith takes on a radically different meaning when meaning making is made by the powerful and empire. And he argues, where would we be in the 20th century had it stayed in the hands of and the meaning making from a small, marginalized Jewish community?
It's provoking.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we have these habits, or we've taken on this meaning making where the faith is associated with this triumphalism, power.
Yeah. Yeah. So we are, in a sense, the metaphor could be breathing in polluted air in some ways, which we internalize and make it more difficult to maintain our psycho-spiritual health. And then the pandemic was what it was, the like accelerant for that. And we try to use old ways of staying well that we're limiting. What I'm hearing you say is it's an ethical, moral, survival issue for pastors and leaders to maintain that well-being. And it's not binary, right? So I almost feel like, okay, well then what should people do for their churches to create those spaces? That's my question. But I almost hesitate to ask it because I know the pastor's going to focus on that and they're going to ignore what we said about survival and taking care of yourself. So it's almost like call me when you've done that when we'll talk about the next one.
To me, it seems like in part, and I say this as a former pastor, part of the goal should be, the question should be, what do we need to do to get well?
Yeah.
Healing has to happen.
Collectively, you're saying we. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then shaping those containers or spaces for that to be, an affirming
shaping
place.
Our practices behind that.
Yeah.
What happens if we shift our goals from measurable outcomes, which generally tends to be budget and people growth?
You're talking churches now, right?
Yes.
Yep.
To something that's more abstract. What do we need to do to get well? In the context course, I'm teaching this course context, and part of it is we talk about how do students understand context when they think about theological education and how to imagine theology and Bible out of context. And we've talked about life cycle stages, and organizations have life cycle stages as well. It's not to secularize the work that we're doing, but life cycle stages, it's inevitable. In its infancy stage, any church is nothing more than a mental model of a group of people coming together with an idea.
Right.
Life happens to that group of people. They grow older, they die, people move on. That could last 100 years. And then it's time to innovate.
Something has to die for
something
new life.
Has to die. And it doesn't have to be a great idea. Innovation, as I'm sharing with the students, is just about be honest with what's in front of you. Name what's in front of you and go from there. You may have seen this article. I'm not going to call it was a Christian historian, came out this weekend. But basically, the title was along the lines of, I'll never bet against Christianity.
Oh, I think I saw this, yeah.
And he wasn't talking about it from a triumphalism standpoint. He was just looking at the last 2,000 years and talking about all the multiple times where we see a rise and a dip, and how the church, and maybe they didn't know they were doing it, but just organically, you have to reinvent yourself. Come to terms with what has happened, and you go from there. Innovation is more about being authentic and truthful than it is about coming up with a magnificent idea. And we talk about that in Westernism too much as what's a magnificent idea. Innovation is about how authentic and truthful can I be, and based on that, go forward in a very faithful way, not denying what's there.
Because the denial pushes it down. Yeah.
It's just the maladaptive behavior, to go back to this golden year fallacy.
And when you say maladaptive, you mean it's a behavior that may have been helpful in the past, but in this context, it's not working.
It's not working.
Yeah. Yep.
This is no different than the research I did with Villanova in Chicago. Now, I grew up in Chicago, but I still wanted to analyze, how urbanism and macroeconomics were affecting churches. So I interviewed 9 churches, starting from the north side of Chicago, going down. A recurring theme that in all of those churches about church growth was the migration out of the South.
Mm-hmm.
That's fundamentally different than where someone may be today in 2023.
Yeah, right.
And so just to say, going back to where we used to have church growth, well, it's in how they prayed. No, it wasn't in how they prayed. It was migration out of the South, and you had an influx of population
coming to Chicago.
In Chicago
Yep.
and other northern cities, Grand Rapids included, Detroit, Pittsburgh, New York, Los Angeles, where you didn't have to do much. Open your doors, be hospitable, and you had growth.
Mm-hmm.
That's fundamentally a different context than what we're dealing with today.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so I'm looking for a pep talk a little bit.
Oh boy.
No, because making the subconscious conscious, you find some scary things.
Yes, you do.
I'm talking about my friends now about this, right? Not myself.
Yeah, right, right.
Others.
Yes, there's other people. Right.
You realize your identity is wrapped up in the church's success, or you realize I actually did spend less time with my kids than I wanted to, or you realize your marriage is in trouble. You realize there's all kinds of things people can find and discover.
Right.
My theory is I'm not a psychologist, but it looks hard. So we find the path of least resistance. It's easier to continue staying busy, looking at numbers, doing all kinds of things other than facing that. What do we gain? What could we gain by facing that individually as leaders and then collectively as communities? What's at stake?
See,
Paint a picture.
What's at stake is your longevity and continuity. See, I'll go back to a previous assumption you made. We can't ignore over the long run.
Yeah.
We lose our strength. We do that in our younger years, but we lose our capacity to do that as we age. We just lose the psychological strength, the spiritual strength to do that. And so, that's what we look at in human development. And what's at stake is living into our later years in a more healthy way versus being disillusioned and embittered.
Yeah.
We become our moral compass ossifies. We become despondent. The onset of nihilism.
We don't experience the continued transformation of the mind. We don't.
You've heard me say this before. When people ask a similar question, people will ask, well, what if I don't engage in grief work? You give up on love.
Yeah.
We have lost enough the last 3 to 4 years. We've lost enough to give up on believing in ourselves, to give up on believing in the human spirit, to give up on believing in the goodness of life. You have to do grief work. You have to come to terms with what has been lost. Grief is the preservative that God has given us to keep us from souring in the face of loss. And you've heard me say this around here before. Again, I believe the book of Job, that is a book of grief work. And despite how many evangelical commentators say he was faithful and God gave him back everything, I don't think that's about God giving him back. Job finding the courage, okay, I'm going to give love another try.
Yeah. Yeah.
Knowing traumatically how you can lose everything. Let me give it another try. But that only comes on the other side of mourning and grief work.
So it feels like an invitation to live more fully.
I like it.
Right?
I like it.
It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be happy all the time, but it's going to be better.
I like it.
I mean, that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah. Life finds a way.
Yeah.
The church can find a way. This is not novel, what is happening to us.
Well said. I feel encouraged.
I do too.
I know. I mean, it's the courage, right? So, well, Dr. Gibson, thank you so much for coming for this conversation.
Thank you.
You speak with wisdom and candor, and I found it personally helpful to talk to you. I hope our listeners do as well. And we have hope.
Thank you for the work you're doing,
Yeah.
Dr. Einfeld, because this is needed in the world. This is needed in the church, and your heart to provide these resources for the church. That's evidence that you never bet against the faith.
No.
We find a way to continue.
Let's find the thing under the thing. Let's work on it. We can do it. And we're not alone.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right, take care.
Thank you for listening to the Forum Podcast. To learn more, go to theforum.calvinseminary.edu.